Hey, everybody, welcome to another week of Film Appreciation. This week we're covering all things editing, and editing is usually the thing people think of when it comes to post production. If you don't know what post production is, there are three production phases to any film: a pre production phase, a production phase, and a post production phase. So the film gets shot, and then after that, everything gets pieced together and turned into a kind of cohesive story. And that's what we're sort of talking about with editing. But let's talk about those production phases first so we have a pretty clear grasp of what belongs to which phase. So, pre production, what most people think about is writing, like script writing. But writing can be broken down into several categories. We can think about like the concept, the initial concept for the film, and that may not even be thought of by the screenwriter. That may be thought of by like a producer who thinks like, hey, let's make another Superman movie. And then that producer would hire someone to write the script for it. But some things are written on spec, meaning that a scriptwriter would just write an entire script without any kind of pay associated with that, and then submit it to some kind of production company trying to get it produced for them. But generally speaking, a lot of these things do happen before a script is even written. One, the concept. Two, the pitch, which would be like, okay, a producer wants a Superman movie, and maybe he dictates maybe the villain for Superman, and then a scriptwriter would then pitch ideas for how to get Superman to fight Brainiac. So a pitch happens, and it could be from multiple writers, and then a producer would decide which of these ideas they want to run with. After that, the script is then developed. So there is what's called a treatment, so a shorter form version of what's going to happen in the film, beat by beat, like all this stuff happens in the first act of the film, all this stuff happens in the second, and all this stuff happens in the third. And then when that's approved, then the actual script writing happens. And if you've ever looked on like IMDb for any major motion picture that like has a lot of money to it, chances are you'll see more than one script writing credit. Even if there's like one main writer, oftentimes there will be multiple writers that go into like helping out dialogue, adding jokes to a script, or maybe rewriting some action just to make it like as strong as it possibly can be. Now, while we think about writing mostly in pre-production, there are some other things too that go into it. Before we ever start rolling our cameras on actors, we need to have the actors present. So casting refers to the act of getting actors for the actual film. So deciding which actors are going to play which roles for that film. Rehearsals happen after casting, where the cast gets together and then they either do something like what's called a table read. They all sit at a table and they read the lines. That's an early form of rehearsals, all the way to like dress rehearsals. So they're in their clothes or in their costume and rehearsing. Also camera rehearsals where they'll work over what's called blocking, where the people go in relation to the camera. So an actor may need to walk around a room as he says this monologue and will dictate exactly how he or she needs to walk around that room. So all that stuff happens in rehearsals. And then also something that happens in pre-production is this thing here called previs or pre-visualization. So previs is just short for that. And previs can come in a few forms too. Right over here we see what are called storyboards, indicating each and every shot that we plan to get during the production phase, so we know how this can kind of fit together, and we can understand what the coverage is for the scenes. Coverage just meaning how many shots and from what angles we're going to get to make sure that we have all of the action covered in camera. So if you have what's called a gap in coverage, maybe there's a very particular line that someone's supposed to say, and we were going to get that in a close-up, but we forgot to get that close-up, and now we don't have that line at all. We have what's called a gap in coverage. There's no shot of this thing that is really important to the story. And then everybody has to get back together and go back and film it because it's important to the story. So previs is something that's really important, especially on large budget productions, because they can hire an artist to do some quick line drawings and, in theory, prevent something from costing a whole lot of money with like reshoots or something. Also, in the same kind of vein are animatics. So animatics are animated storyboards, and these come in various forms. They could look just like these still storyboards, except they may have the actors themselves or somebody standing in for the actors reading the lines, maybe a few sound effects in there too, and then the shots play out like a video. Right? They may be still images, but they have time associated with them. This is how long the shot's going to be on screen, and then we'll move to the next one. This gives us a much better idea of what the pace will be like for the actual edit. So this can be much more helpful than just storyboards to understand what is necessary before going into production. Now, there are other types of animatics. There are CGI animatics that kind of show how a character might move or how the camera might actually move. In the case of these storyboards that you see here, you see these arrows, and that indicates like how a character is moving or how the camera is moving around a character. So depending on how big of a production this is and how big of a budget it has, you may see either storyboards or animatics or something kind of in between, maybe animatics for an action sequence and storyboards for a dialogue sequence, to understand how the film is actually going to be produced before we ever start rolling that film. So the second production phase, and the shortest one of the bunch, is the production phase. So this includes principal photography, which just means the stuff that we're shooting of the actors performing their roles on set or on location. So everything that you see in a movie, minus a few things that was captured by the camera, belongs to principal photography. Now, if we went back and shot that stuff later, so that example of having a gap in coverage and we have to come back to it, that would be called a pickup, meaning that we have to pick up that shot that we missed. But pickups can also happen for not just gaps in coverage, but maybe like we're supposed to shoot something outside in a field and it's not supposed to be raining, but then it rains. So then you need to go pick up those shots later, and not at the time that it was initially scheduled. Likewise, there's sound that belongs to the production phase, meaning that all the dialogue that is delivered by the actors on set is going to be captured by some kind of microphone, and that would be on set or location sound. The difference being on set is in a sound stage with a set that's built, and alternatively on location means that the crew and cast went someplace out in the world to film some stuff. So if you've ever seen people even outside anywhere other than like the back lot of Universal Studios, that chances are they're on location somewhere. If you see someone climbing a mountain, if they're at an actual mountain, that would be on location, not on set. So it is generally the shortest production phase, but it is also the thing that people think of most when they think of how people make a film. They think about the camera on a set somewhere with the actors performing, but a whole lot goes into that. But a whole lot goes into it before and after. So the third production phase is post-production, and what we generally think about when we think about post-production is editing. So editing is taking all the shots that we got on set or on location, piecing it together, choosing the best takes. So maybe the actor flubbed a line, that would be something really obvious, but maybe we have 3 versions of the same line, and they all are a little bit different, and we're going to decide which one is best for our film. Now, also in editing, we do things like remove things that aren't good. Sometimes that's whole scenes. If you've ever seen deleted scenes for a film, that's exactly what happened there. That somewhere along the way, a producer, director, or editor decided that the scene didn't quite fit the film. And then also potentially you've seen alternate endings for films. In the editing phase, that stuff has to be chosen too. Whether or not that is the editor's choice or the director's choice or a producer's choice is completely dependent on the project. So some directors take a very strong creative stance with the film and decide basically every creative decision that they can. But if it's more like a big budget studio thing, if it's a superhero film, for example, chances are those decisions would be made by committee. So all the people, all the creative forces associated with it come together and they decide whether or not the scene should go or stay. But there are many other things that go into post-production. Color grading, if you've never heard of this before, that is the creative adjustment of the color in a film. So if you've ever seen something like The Matrix before, when they actually enter the Matrix, everything looks green. That's not like color correction, like fixing things. It's clearly different than how you see real life. So they use a very distinct color grade between the real world and the Matrix world to differentiate between these two spaces. So color grading has been a pretty big thing since the early 2000s. Oh Brother, Where Art Thou was like a really big moment for color grading since that was done all digitally. But since then, films have become more and more digital in their post-production techniques, and color grading has become incredibly prevalent. It would be very surprising not to see any kind of color grading done on any film today. Visual effects are also done in post-production. So special effects are broken down into practical effects and visual effects, and we'll talk all about practical and visual effects coming up. We have a whole lesson on that stuff. So I'll just leave that for now, and we'll come back around to it in a couple of weeks. Foley and ADR, both of these things are done in post-production as well. So Foley means sound effects recorded outside of the actual production phase. If you've ever seen anyone smashing a watermelon to make the sound of someone's head getting smashed or something, or breaking celery for bones breaking, or even just like tapping shoes on a table to replicate the sound of footsteps for a character in a film, that is what's called Foley. So there are Foley artists in studios that do only that. ADR is kind of similar to Foley, but it's dialogue. Automated dialogue replacement, which you absolutely don't need to remember. Just remember ADR. That is recording a line with the same actor that was on set after the fact in the same kind of way, and then replacing the original line with the re-recorded line. Now, why would you do something like this? Well, one is for audio quality. So again, if we have a character on a mountainside and the wind is blowing and they're supposed to be kind of whispering to someone, chances are that microphone cannot pick that up very well. It's going to pick up a whole bunch of wind, even if it's really close to the actor. And in that case, ADR is absolutely required because you won't be able to hear what the person's saying without it. But also ADR can work as a way to enhance performances. There are various notable actors that sort of mumble their lines, and they hope to enhance their performance actually in ADR. So they are only thinking about the visual on set, and then ADR comes in to actually give us clear comprehensible lines where we can actually tell what the person's saying. And then finally, sometimes we'll use ADR to fill in the gaps for story elements. So if someone's head, like we're looking at the back of their head in a shot, we can actually put in lines that weren't there before. So if there was anything confusing about the story, we can sort of hide things that way. Sometimes in older movies, we can see ADR used this way where it's like a really wide shot, so they're far away, and then they'll use ADR to kind of loop in a line that wasn't there previously. And if you've ever seen this before, like with remastered films, you might actually notice it where other people didn't, because the quality of displays were just not as good before. Okay, also in post-production, we have this thing here, deliverables. So deliverables are all the things that an editor or post-production person has to submit to get their film distributed. Now, in theaters, we don't necessarily see a whole lot of subtitles because the dialogue is English, and we expect the audience to be English watching it, so you won't see subtitles there. However, if you watch a foreign film in theaters, you'd see subtitles there. Likewise, American films get sent out to other countries where English isn't their native language, and subtitles are helpful out there. So certainly all films, if they're seeking some kind of major distribution, require subtitles. Subtitles meaning just like a transcript of all of the dialogue that exists, and then sometimes that transcript is translated into other languages. This is different than closed captions. If you're familiar with closed captions, that is for people that are either hard of hearing or want to read the film rather than listen to the film. So if you muted the film, you would still get everything that you need from it. So that doesn't just include dialogue. Instead, it also has things like important music cues, I might say in parentheses, dramatic music, or important sound effects. So glass breaking, and it's happening off screen, and we are supposed to hear that to know that someone's breaking into a house. That would certainly be in parentheses there. So sound effects and music also included in closed captions, but subtitles are strictly for dialogue. All right, now also in deliverables, we have to submit the film in various forms. So the film, in theory, goes to several different places. One is a theatrical version, one is a potentially streaming version. So if you're watching something on Netflix or HBO Max, that would be a different edit than the theatrical. And you may not notice any difference between the two, but there is at least one most of the time. Finally, edited for TV, there you would certainly see a difference. Things like profanity would be edited out, and we can even go back to this ADR section where an actor may read their line differently with profanity gone from it, just to censor for television distribution. Now, other things edited for TV, though, commercial breaks. So a film needs to fit within a certain time period. Usually that's about 2 hours. If it's a longer film, maybe 2.5 or even 3 hours. But they need to have various moments where we can cut away from the film to give people a series of commercials, because that's what supports television. These things would be incredibly obvious to you if you were watching a film on TV and you had previously seen a film anywhere else. Now, the differences between theatrical and streaming are much more subtle, but usually that's two different things. One is color grading. So again, that adjustment of color for some kind of creative effect, it's going to be different for projectors using DCP projection versus someone's television in their house. So you may see some subtle differences in color from the theatrical to the streaming side, but chances are you wouldn't even notice those things at all. Likewise, there's a thing that's going on the sound side that you may not notice either. So if you go to a movie and you're seeing a big blockbuster film, chances are you're hearing it in 7.1 surround sound, and things like people talking will be at a very low level, and like the music will be much higher, but everything's going to be pretty clear for you in the theater. Whereas if you listen to that same sort of sound mix in your home, even if you have a nice home theater surround sound system, you may notice that you almost want to turn up the volume dial and turn it back down for dialogue versus music. If you've ever had that experience before, you may actually be watching something with the original theatrical mix. One of the big filmmakers that insist on keeping the theatrical sound mix is Christopher Nolan. So if you've ever seen a Christopher Nolan film before, including the Dark Knight series or Tenet or any of his other films, you may notice that the sound is very low for the dialogue and much higher for sound effects and music. And if you felt like that felt weird in your space and you wanted to turn things up and down, maybe you even did, then you understand why a whole lot of people will insist on doing different mixes for streaming release or even practical Blu-rays and stuff. It's intended for people watching their stuff in their homes, so things have to be adjusted for that. But in theory, it still maintains the integrity of the original theatrical release. Finally, there are things like graphics that go into deliverables. So if you're looking through Netflix, you may notice like thumbnail images of the poster. That thing is actually called a piece of key art. So that key art will probably be used in the posters outside of theaters, as well as thumbnail images and just promotion of the film in generally. And all the graphics for publicity, including like characters in costume or any number of things, maybe like the logo or anything like that, and other things for publicity like the logo image, potentially parallax images. If you've ever left Netflix on for a while and it does that screensaver thing where it looks kind of 3D and the camera's moving even though it's a still image, that's called the parallax. That would be a deliverable graphic. Also anything that just like features the actors and stuff, trying to get people to notice that the film's either coming out or has been released. All those things are graphics, and that's part of the post-production process. Even though it's more for like publicity and marketing, it's still done in post-production. So here are a few significant editing terms, and these are foundational elements. So you'll probably find yourself using at least a couple of these. Continuity, so that is usually defined by cut on action, which you'll see in a video that I have assigned after this one. So continuity of space and motion from one shot to another. So the idea here is everything, even though we're cutting from and to various actions and different people within the space, everything feels fluid and happening right now, even though we're cutting around and stuff. And the reason why it feels like that is continuity. I have a ball, I'm going to throw that ball, and we see in... So for example, I am in a shot, I have a baseball, and I'm going to throw that baseball. You see me pick up the baseball and throw it, and now we're going to cut to the other side where someone catches the baseball. That continuity of action from one space to another is paramount in our understanding and our immersion in the film. So another major term here is transition, and this can get a little bit confusing between transitions and cuts. So cut, we usually just kind of refer to something that's happening within a scene. So someone's talking, we cut, and then someone else is now talking in a different shot. So we're cutting between shots within a single scene. A transition just means that we're moving from one scene into another. Now, you can transition from one scene into another using a cut. Hence the confusion that often happens here. So any kind of cut can work as a transition. However, not any kind of transition can work as a cut. Now, typically speaking, in a regular narrative film, we don't dissolve mid-scene to another thing that's happening. Instead, we dissolve from one scene to another, or from one time to another. So a transition can also happen between the same scene from one time to another. So transition can also mean moving from the same scene to the same scene at a later period. So if you're looking at a coffee shop and we see people in the coffee shop, and then we're going to maybe dissolve to the coffee shop again, but now it's closed, the lights are off. That is still a transition, even though we haven't changed the place, we've changed the time. So it can get a little confusing what constitutes a transition versus a cut. But honestly, if you are confused about this stuff, if you are identifying a specific technique, a dissolve, a cut on action, a J cut, an L cut, a smash cut, a match cut, all of these things that you'll see in an assigned video, if you say those things specifically, that is absolutely accurate, regardless of whether or not it's within a scene or shifting from one scene to another. Finally, on this list here, I have pace. And that just means the visual rhythm of images. So, how quickly our images are cut together versus how slowly our images are cut together. So, typically, we see pace dictated by the content or tone of a particular scene. The pace will not stay consistent, like absolutely consistent throughout an entire film, or that would be pretty boring visually for us. But instead, if we have something like an action sequence, chances are that will be paced out a lot quicker than something like a dialogue sequence, especially like a very dramatic dialogue sequence. So if you feel like the shots are coming faster than they were previously, very likely what you're experiencing is the pace ramping up for this particular scene. So here we have a couple of examples from Georges Méliès, and I go into detail about Georges Méliès and his contributions to film history in the film history class. So if you decide to take that, or maybe you've already taken that, then you are intimately familiar with Georges Méliès. But it's worth noting here, talking about editing, this guy is basically the founder of editing in narrative films. So you can see a couple of things, like some techniques in here where there are dissolves. These are the very first dissolves in film history, and it's a little bit crude, but it's for its time incredible, and something that's still used prevalently in modern films. So Georges Méliès got a hold of a film camera, actually a film projector, and made his own film camera. In his first experiments, he's cranking this camera and he's looking at a city street, and the film jams. And then he fixes his camera and continues to film. And when he processes the film and plays it back, it looks like everything has changed, like carriages have changed into people and people have changed into horses because of that cut between the time. That's like a jump cut, the same shot with a jump in time. And he thought that that had great potential for both telling stories on screen as well as magic stuff. So if you look at his early work here, you can see what's called the stop trick. So even today, you see some TikToks that do some clever editing business where someone might like slap a table and then all of a sudden things appear on that table. It's kind of a distraction from the action, but also there's a jump cut that happens there where they lay in the things that weren't there before, and it almost appears like a magic trick on screen. All that stuff was established as far back as the early 1900s, like 1902 was A Trip to the Moon. That's Georges Méliès's major motion picture, the thing that we just looked at over here with the moon face, as well as all of his short films. So if you wonder where all this stuff comes from, it's very well rooted in film history. It's been around since almost the offset. Since the beginning of telling stories as films, editing has been around. Here's just a little bit more of film history for you. Soviet montage. So when we're talking about continuity, having a continuous action from one shot to another, there is one major thing that is outside of continuity editing, and that is montage. So a series of non-continuous images. What we usually think of with montage is some kind of training montage, Rocky getting ready for his big fight, or someone even prepping for I don't know, a big test in a film. You may see how they do it, and it's a compression of time. So maybe Rocky takes 2 months to get ready for his boxing match, and how we're going to see it is maybe like 5 minutes of him training, and he starts out not so good at something, and he gets really good at it over the course of those 5 minutes. So that's usually what we think about with a montage, but there are several kinds of montages. There are like process montages that you may see in a series of maybe like 5 shots, just kind of setting up a scene for us. It may be a more interesting way to enter a scene than the general Hollywood style that we looked at before, where we see a wide shot and work our way closer. Maybe we see a series of 3 quick shots of eggs cracking, the egg hits a pan and it starts frying, and then we plate up a meal before 2 people sit down and have a meal for breakfast. That sort of montage happens all the time in films. and is certainly less noticeable than the like longer training montage that makes a serious impact on the story. Instead, those little process montages are just a way to get through something much faster that would otherwise maybe not be as interesting to actually watch in detail. Now, most montage can be traced back to Soviet montage. There are these ideas of metric montage, rhythmic montage, tonal montage, overtonal montage, intellectual montage, all these things. Again, if you want more detail, we can go through that in the film history class. But all these things came from the Soviets had film schools, but they didn't have access to much raw film stock, meaning that they couldn't go out and film stuff quite as much as they maybe wanted to. So they had things that were already shot, and then they experimented with editing a lot. And they developed things like those Soviet montage techniques. And all montage sort of goes into this idea of a gestalt. That's a psychological term, a German term, not a Russian term. But the idea here is the sum of the parts are greater than the parts individually. The 1 + 1 = 3 equation that you see there. So if I have a shot of one thing, a shot of another thing, in my mind, I put those two shots together and I have a bigger idea of what's going on here than the shots individually. Now, that relates closely to this experiment that happened in Soviet Russia, which would eventually lead to what is called the Kuleshov effect. So what we see here are 3 different experiments: a shot of a soup and a man, a shot of a child in a coffin and the same man, and then finally a shot of this woman who is apparently scantily clad. I guess for the time period that was the case, and then the man again. We're going to see them all play back now all together, and the idea here is this man is not reacting to any of these things, but when audiences were presented with the 2 images put together, they thought that he was looking at the child, and he was maybe sad about the child in the coffin. He was looking at the soup. Maybe he was hungry for the soup. That's how they felt about what he was thinking. And maybe he was lustful for the woman on the couch there. All the same reactions. Now, when I played these back, if you felt like they belonged together, you are in the same boat as the Soviet audiences that Soviet Russian filmmakers tested with this Kuleshov effect. Okay, so from here, I usually show like this video in my class, but I'm just going to link to it for you since it's from a different YouTuber and I don't want our lesson video to get taken down. So this is from Rocket Jump Film School, and it's cuts and transitions. You'll see in action various cuts and various transitions and the names for each of those. So those things that I mentioned before: jump cuts, match cuts, smash cuts, J cuts, L cuts, cut on action, all those things, dissolves, fades. You'll see all those things inside this video and all of the names for them. Now, it does go quickly, so I highly recommend that you bookmark this video in case you need to reference it later. Maybe you see a really cool transition in the film that you saw, and you want to say like, oh yeah, I saw, is that a match cut or is that a jump cut? So you can go back into the video, you watch that thing through again. It's not very long, and you can find out specifically what cut it is. Now, when you're writing about this stuff, as well as, cinematography or any production elements, I wouldn't recommend that you just identify basic cuts and transitions, but instead look for things that stand out to you as you're watching the film. If anything seems really interesting or cool or innovative, then use the vocabulary and definitions and nomenclature that you've learned to describe it concisely and accurately. So it's a fairly short presentation this week. You do need to watch the cuts and transitions video as well, and I'll have instructions for you about what our discussion is this week in our announcement. So if you haven't read that already, make sure that you do. And one last thing while I have you here. So I have mentioned before in our course overview video, our syllabus video, as well as in our announcements, what our requirements are for our blogs. But I'm going to reiterate here. Hopefully, if all you're doing is watching the videos, you at least get it. So it's 2 pages, double spaced. If I copied your text from your blog and put it into a Word document and turned it to Times New Roman 12-point font and double spaced it, it should be at least 2 pages at minimum. Or if all that stuff seems too difficult for you, 5 fully formed paragraphs, meaning that absolute minimum 4 sentences for those 5 fully formed paragraphs. And even if you have more than 4 sentences in a paragraph, it doesn't mean it's fully formed unless you introduce an idea and analyze and interpret it properly. So if you just tell me something you saw in the film and you tell me about that thing you saw again and again and again in 4 different sentences, I would think fairly objectively we can say that that is not a fully formed paragraph. A lot of you are doing incredibly well on your blogs, but I've gotten several emails about what the requirements are. So just reiterating once again, 2 pages double spaced at minimum, or 5 fully formed paragraphs at minimum. If you have 6 fully formed paragraphs, you're totally fine. If you have 4, you will receive points off, most certainly. All right, so that's it for this week. Check that announcement for signed films and discussion, and then we'll have another discussion next week as well as a blog post. Good luck this week. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any other questions.